This video is brought to you by Artistworks. Artistworks are part of TrueFire Studios, and they offer direct access to master musicians through their innovative online learning platform. Partnering with iconic musicians, they've crafted decades of industry experience into guided paths of online learning. Crucially, there's an option to get personalized feedback tailored specifically to your playing via their unique video exchange. Get direct guidance towards your playing goals. You can use the code GNC40 for 40% off of any of Artistworks courses.
Patreon, where I put the tabs and backing tracks for all of the kind of lesson type videos that I do. Jennifer asked a really interesting question this week, and that was around the idea sort of how often do you practice these things, or how do you practice these things? Do you revisit them? And I thought it might be good to talk about some of this stuff from the point of view of some of the people that I think have said sensible things on this stuff in the past. So Bob Reynolds, sax player for Snarky Puppy, he's got his own YouTube channel, and there's a video that he's practicing a lick on. He shows how he practices licks along, or plays and learns licks along with like a record, which is, I think, one of the best ways that you can do this sort of stuff. So in his case, I think it's the context of like a Charlie Parker lick. And yeah, so he's sort of playing along with the thing, and one of the things that he says in that video is that he's not necessarily practicing the lick to regurgitate it at a later date. In some ways, what he's basically saying is that learning the lick itself for that session is in and of itself the point of doing it. Not necessarily that at some stage later down the road you want to revisit and learn it again, unless you really like that lick. But basically the lick itself, the exercise of learning it and playing it and figuring out how to play it on your instrument that's the goal just by itself. That's kind of an interesting perspective, I feel, because what you can then view the lick as is kind of just like a practice session or a couple of practice sessions, and you don't necessarily need to worry like, will I remember this one day or not? So there's a bunch of things that I've done to that effect. So I've learned licks by Wayne Krantz, I've learned licks by Tom Quayle, I've learned loads of bits and pieces, I've learned solos by Cannonball Adderley and this sort of stuff. Not all of it sticks, but the idea is that you've got kind of this short-term goal, and that's kind of what I like about doing these Monday lessons. It gives me something to work on as well, so that I can present the lesson to you. So maybe you don't have to keep it in mind that this necessarily has to be something that will one day come out in your playing. The idea is that by practicing kind of licks or exercises regularly, what you are doing is kind of practicing real meat and potatoes stuff, which is of benefit anyway. And this is a thing that I look at David Beebe for, because I know that in his legato playing, he's been really methodical about putting together like exercises that specifically will target things that he's weaker at. And that's quite an interesting approach to it as well, I think. So if you write an exercise that solves a problem, or for me as well, like I've looked at things that I've seen people doing, like Joshua Della Victoria, who's doing like a doubling thing on the adjacent string. So I thought, well, what is going on here, and broke that apart. And by doing these exercises, sometimes it basically just does become part of your playing. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you might remember bits and pieces, sometimes you might forget them, but don't worry about it too much. I think the purpose is that in and of itself, just keeping your fingers moving through some of these exercises can be really beneficial anyway.
I guess also one thing worth mentioning before we get too far into this video is, how do you find these sorts of things? So the thing that works for me is that I just look for things that literally I might have not heard before, or things that jump out to me, or things that folks like you may be watching this ask me to break down. So it might be a Pierre Donnell lick, it might be a Joshua Della Victoria lick, it might be some Alan Holdsworth type stuff, it might be Eric Johnson stuff, it might be my own stuff that someone's asked me to break down, it might be something by David Beebe. But basically anything is on the table. Thing to look for is, does the thing jump out to you? Does it sound cool? Do you like the sound of it? And that is a good enough reason in and of itself to try and break it apart and figure out what is happening. That's how I find licks. Then go on to, hopefully there'll be like a YouTube video of them playing it, or an Instagram video. Rip those, slow them down, and try and figure out the phrase, and maybe write it down as you go. The writing it down part is not necessarily always essential, because you can just memorize the thing, but sometimes writing it down can mean that you can come back to it later and not have to relearn the whole thing again frame by frame. And then once you've figured out the lick, the general thing to do is to use a metronome and gradually get the thing up to speed and try and memorize it. There are things outside of that you can do, but I think that's like the basics, right?
Another thing on this point was that Alan Holdsworth in an interview talked about practicing certain things and it taking a while for it to actually show up in your playing when you're improvising or whatever. And that's a fair point as well. So some kind of new concepts that you're working on don't necessarily always translate until a little bit later down the line. There seems to be like a processing thing. One of the ways that I'll talk about in this video that we can try and nudge that along is to sort of plan where we're going to place licks, and in that way I think we can kind of jump between improvisation and switching on playing a lick, and in that way I think we can sort of encourage the process along a little bit. So I had a lick today that David Beebe pointed out in one of my videos that he kind of liked, so I just wanted to break that down, and I'll just show you kind of a couple of concepts around it. Going to be in G major for the lick, and we're starting off or E minor, G major. Kind of here on the 7th fret. That's our first little fragment. 7, 10, 7, 10, 7, 9. And with all of these licks, I think it's really beneficial as well if you are just to sort of step outside the lick a bit and take any fragment and sort of move it diatonically through the scale. So if I'm in G major, notice the shape of what's happening. So 2 notes, missing 1. That kind of thing, really useful. Then 10, 7, 9, 7, 11. Then we jump back down to this 9, 7, 11, 8, 12, 8, 10, 12, 10, 12, 14, 10, 12, 10. So that's our first bar. And if I like the sound of these specific things, these licks, then what I might do then is move them around into other keys so that they become something I could do in another key. So maybe if you try it in F, and just move it around that way, or in E. But I need to be able to do that to figure out where I'm starting. So the 3rd G is where I'm starting. Okay, and then the 2nd bar, sort of 12, 10, 12, 11, 14, 12, 14, 11, 14, back down 12, 11, 14, 11, 12, and slide up to 14, 12, 15, 14, 12, 15, 12, 15, 17, 15, 12, 15. And what I would do for this stuff, and this is what I mean, like in and of itself, just practicing this one specific lick, what are we doing? We're actually we are teaching our hand these movements as we go, but we can be working on the general principles of legato, and this can just be a thing that over time, the more you do this, I think you find a bit more control. So whether or not this actual legato lick would stick in my memory for very long at all, I've no idea, but just by sitting and focusing on it for a session or a few, can be really beneficial. And having a lick that's maybe 1 or 2 bars long can be short enough that you can actually move it into other keys. And also it becomes a thing that maybe might creep out in your playing later on, or aspects of it. So think about where the phrase starts, and you could also think, if you want this to creep out and you're playing a bit more, in your improvisation think, right, I'm going to place it here on the 3rd bar, and maybe you even think about how you might lead into the lick. So another thing you might do, think of ways that you could get into that lick with and how you might enter and figure out different ways that you could start a lick somewhere else and end up playing this. So something like that could work. And you could do the same thing with like figuring out a different ending. So if you have a lick that you really like the sound of, what I would do personally, or that you really like practicing, is figure it out in as many different keys as you can. Maybe even make your own mini exercises out of it. So you might take specific phrases that you really like and make your own little exercises out of that. And yeah, if you really like the whole lick, then figure it out in different keys by figuring out the starting point and the ending point relative to your key. So if we're starting on our third, then I could visualize it in F. And another thing to do is to get it so you're not having to read it from the paper, so you've actually memorized the lick. That's a really quite a crucial thing, to be able to sort of stick it into your improvisation, and then plan it so that you're playing and improvising around this lick, and you're being kind of intentional and saying, right, on every third bar I'm going to start playing this lick. That's a way that you can start to force yourself to see it as an opportunity. But even if you don't do any of that, even if you just spend one session with a lick, I think you get benefits from it kind of being a bit of a mental challenge, as well as the physicality of it. And that's the thing for me, is that by doing lots of these kind of lick lessons, I'm getting my fingers moving in intentional ways rather than always improvising or always playing someone else's lick or always playing, I don't know, a whole song. I can kind of manipulate these smaller phrases in a way that is a bit more conducive to one session or two sessions, but also is keeping my fingers moving. I hope that helps a bit, Jennifer. And if you want the tab for this, Patreon and the backing track. And that's what I was doing in the intro there, trying to work this lick into the context of the backing track and otherwise improvise around it. I'll catch you in another video soon. Hope that helps. Cheers.